she walked into the forest. Broad daylight, less than 2 miles. People saw her go. She never came back. Every year, hundreds of people go missing in national parks, cities, and quiet suburbs across America. Most are found. Some leave clues, but a few, they vanish like smoke. In today's video, we're looking at 3 of the most bizarre, frustrating, and chilling disappearances in modern American history. Viewer discretion is advised. So, in today's video, we're gonna go over some of these impossible disappearances. As always, viewer discretion is advised. Music. In mid-July of 1981, 14-year-old Emily Ray Morgan, her father, David, and a small group of outdoor enthusiasts were horseback riding and camping their way through some of Great Smoky Mountains National Park's most rugged and scenic backcountry. Emily and David have been looking forward to the trip for months, and they planned on making the most of the excursion by exploring, bonding, and just generally enjoying the beautiful scenery. The trip was relatively uneventful early on, but that changed on the afternoon of July 17th, when Emily decided to hike from their camping area to Lake Echo, less than 2 miles away. David was too tired to join her, so instead, an elderly man they were traveling with accompanied her about half of the way before he also decided he was too tired and returned to camp. Emily said goodbye and continued on alone, and that was the last time anyone ever saw her. Emily Ray Morgan was born to David and Linda Morgan on September 29, 1966. What happened next would baffle everyone, even the most seasoned searchers. She was the youngest of 4, and the family lived in Asheville, North Carolina, a few miles southwest of Knoxville, which is also conveniently just a few hours' drive from Great Smoky Mountains National Park to the east. When Emily turned 14, she and her father began planning a father-daughter trip, and they officially settled on a multi-day trip along the 49-mile Appalachian Loop Trail. This trail was the best of both worlds because it allowed them to travel through some of the park's most beautiful remote areas, while also giving them the safety and comfort of spending each night with other travelers in a moderately developed camping area. After a normal day of riding on the afternoon of July 15, 1981, Emily, her father, and their guide, and the other travelers finally arrived at the Cataloochee camping area, where they planned to get comfortable, eat a big dinner, and then turn in early. At the same time, there were still plenty of daylight left by the time they got settled in, and Emily still had lots of energy. In this beautiful area, she just couldn't resist the lure of the nearby Lake Echo, which was surrounded by forests and alpine meadow, and Mounts Florence and Clark in the background. So while everyone else was relaxing and discussing the day's trip, Emily changed into fresh clothes, swapped her hiking boots for sandals, and grabbed her camera. She may have assumed her father would join her, but by then he was more interested in relaxing and enjoying the scenery. He suggested that Emily changed back into her boots if she planned on hiking to the lake. Then, another man, 77-year-old Gerald Stewart, said that he was also up for a short walk, so he and Emily set off down the trail a few minutes later. But after walking just a couple hundred feet, Gerald ran out of energy and decided to head back. Emily wanted to continue on, and campers and guides actually watched as the two said goodbye to one another, and then started walking the opposite direction. While Emily was gone, other groups arrived at the campground throughout the afternoon and into the early evening. And after a little while, when Emily didn't come back from the lake, David and Stuart started to worry. Panic hadn't quite set in yet, but as darkness fell, David and Gerald began searching the camp and asking the newly arrived hikers if they'd seen anyone resembling Emily. Then, when not a single person had seen any sign of her, it started to clue in that Emily might be in some trouble. Maybe she'd gotten hurt on the trail and was still there, or maybe something worse had happened. Before long, David had told the rest of the group, and a full search was launched. Thankfully, by then, there were quite a few others at the campsite who were willing to fan out and look for Emily. When small groups began walking down the trail and toward the lake, it must have seemed like Emily would have found pretty quickly, and then everyone would laugh it off as a misunderstanding. But then, searchers scoured the trail and the lake area, blew whistles, and repeatedly shouted Emily's name. But there were still no sign of her. According to her father, she had been carrying binoculars and wearing earrings and an ankle bracelet. But the only item that turned up was a camera lens found in a wooded area she must have passed through on her way to the lake. This initial search lasted well into the night, and soon enough, some of the searches started to think that she might have been abducted or attacked by a wild animal. A haunting clue, one piece where everything else had vanished. Unfortunately, no signs of a struggle were found either, which made the search even weirder. They also started to consider the possibility that she could have drowned in the lake, fallen into a hidden crevice, or panicked after realizing she was lost. If she had panicked, she might have made the all-too-common mistake of trying to hike her way to safety instead of staying where she was and letting rescuers find her. Then, in her panic, she could have gotten much more lost than she otherwise would have. Whatever the case, it was a long night for her father. The following morning, the National Park Service joined the search, and everyone was hopeful that with all their expertise, Emily would be found in no time. Over the next few days, nearly 150 searchers converged on the area, about half of which were Mountain Rescue Association volunteers, who collectively had decades of experience tracking people down who had gotten missing in wilderness areas. But even with all that effort, not a single new clue was found. Scent dogs and helicopters were eventually called in too, but even though they went over a 5-square-mile area around the campground in Lake Echo, nothing new was ever found. The case was so perplexing that one volunteer apparently said that it seemed like Emily had just disappeared off the face of the earth. And as the days dragged on, everyone knew that the odds of finding her alive were becoming increasingly slim. In the meantime, the Park Service had a good idea of who was in the area, since visitors and guides were required to register and obtain backcountry permits. They questioned everyone they could and displayed posters of Emily along the trail and around the campground. But tragically, after 12 days, the search was officially called off. By mid-October, the trails were largely empty, and with the wintry weather settling in, park officials and rescuers assumed they'd find Emily's remains the following spring after the big thaw. Unfortunately, that wouldn't be the case either. Investigators are often inundated by questionable tips and supposed sightings when people go missing, and Emily's case is no exception. In fact, Park Service investigators got calls from multiple tipsters who claimed to have seen Emily in western states like Oregon, Nevada, and Arizona. And as is often the case with these types of cases, a number of theories have arisen despite the lack of physical evidence. Maybe the most likely is that Emily fell into a pit or crevice, or got lost and hiked into a remote area of the 750,000-acre park, and then tragically died of dehydration or hypothermia. Then, there's also the animal attack theory. Park officials estimated that between 300 and 500 black bears live in Great Smoky Mountains, but officially, nobody's ever been killed or seriously injured by a bear in the park. So this theory isn't particularly likely. Officials also looked at the possibility of a mountain lion attack, because after all, mountain lions do occasionally attack humans. But if Emily had been attacked by one or any animal for that matter, there almost certainly would have been blood, torn clothing, or signs of struggle. And of course, the final theory is that Emily could have been abducted or maybe even run away. Each of these theories doesn't seem particularly likely, either because of how remote the area is. In any case, whatever happened to Emily Ray Morgan, she may have been within a stone's throw of the searchers in the early part of the search, which makes things even more frustrating. And as a result of this, it's often asked why she hadn't responded to rescuer shouts or whistles if she'd been in such close proximity to them. The fact is that experienced search and rescue personnel experience this phenomenon all the time. In the wilderness, unfortunately, sound rarely behaves like we think it should. In any case, adding another layer of mystery to her disappearance, David Paulides of Missing 411 fame apparently filed a number of Freedom of Information requests with the Park Service to get information on Emily's case, but each of his requests was denied. In the Park Service's defense, they've made a PDF file available online for anyone interested in looking into the case, but the file only includes a few official documents, and otherwise, it's mostly just old Forest Service maps, grainy photographs, and newspaper clippings that don't shed any new light on the case. Emily is the only person to have ever disappeared from the Lake Echo area. Brandon Ellis Carter was born in Grand Island, Missouri on June 24, 1981. He and his family moved to Springfield a few years later and settled into pleasant and relatively uneventful lives. As a kid, Brandon was shy and quiet, and he often became disoriented and overwhelmed in noisy, crowded, and stressful situations. Which raises one disturbing question. Why her? He also had speech and learning disabilities that made communicating and concentrating difficult. But he was responsible and hardworking and was clearly intelligent despite everything else. He went on to attend Springfield Benson High School and enrolled in the broadcasting program at a community college in a nearby city shortly after graduating. During this time, he also had a job at a pizza and pasta restaurant just a few miles from his house. As with many people his age, Brandon wasn't exactly sure where his life was headed. He always thought he'd make a good DJ because it would allow him to connect with people without getting too personal. And then, in a lucky break, despite being shy and reserved, Brandon landed a part-time DJ gig at the campus radio station. At the same time, however, he was considering going in a completely different direction and thought about enrolling in a seminary in Kansas City. But then, by the summer of 2001, it was clear that he might not get to even enroll in either choice if he didn't make enough money to pay for spring tuition. So, until he decided between broadcasting and theology, he'd just have to make the most of his summer vacation by pinching pennies and working as many hours as he could at the restaurant. Ironically, that's exactly what he was trying to do the day he disappeared. It must have seemed like just another day when the now 19-year-old Brandon woke up in the morning of Wednesday, June 12, 2001. Brandon was scheduled to start work at the restaurant at 5:30 p.m., but with the exception of helping his brother with a few household chores, his schedule was wide open. That changed a few hours later when his manager called and asked if he could come into work at noon. And since Brandon needed the extra money and liked helping out whenever he could, he agreed to go in early. Unfortunately, his car was in the shop and his parents were at work, so he figured he'd just walk to work that day instead. It was nice enough outside, and he'd made that walk plenty of times. But then, as a thank you for coming in early, his boss arranged for a coworker to pick him up on her way to the restaurant. Giving directions wasn't one of Brandon's strong points, and after a few failed attempts, he agreed to meet the girl in front of Springfield Benson High School. The school was just 4 blocks from Brandon's house, and since the girl had graduated from the school too, she knew exactly where it was. At about 10:45 a.m., Brandon and his brother dragged their empty trash cans from the street into the garage, and while they were doing this, a neighbor saw them together and noticed that Brandon was wearing a baseball cap, a Chicago Cubs shirt, and black pants. He was also carrying, not wearing, his red restaurant uniform. This was the last known sighting of Brandon. After saying goodbye to his brother, he walked down their driveway and then toward the school. Just a few blocks away, his coworker got to the school and sat there for a little while before starting to think that maybe Brandon had gone to the wrong place. He walked down the driveway and into thin air. After waiting for a little while longer, and with their shifts coming up, she drove to a nearby gas station and called his house to see if he was on the way. Brandon's brother, Michael, picked up the phone and, as a joke, pretended to be Brandon, but eventually told her that his brother had left and should be there any second. But Brandon never showed up, and eventually the girl called her boss to ask what she should do. He told her to wait for a few more minutes and then drive to work herself if he didn't arrive, because her shift was about to start. While she was waiting, the manager also called Brandon's house and spoke to Michael, but again, all he could tell him was that his brother had already left. The weird thing was that Brandon was a lot less impulsive than many teenagers, and missing a shift like that was completely out of character for him. But alarm bells didn't really start to go off until early that evening, when he still hadn't shown up to work or back home. Eventually, Michael heard back from the restaurant that Brandon still hadn't shown up, and he hadn't returned home either. So Brandon's parents both left work early to start to look for him. They began by covering and retracing the distance between their home and the school, as well as the route he would have taken if he'd ended up walking the entire way to work. While they were searching, they just had this feeling that something terrible had happened to him. It was so unlike Brandon to do something like this. He was a responsible Christian homebody with a number of learning disabilities. On top of that, he'd never even tried drugs or alcohol as far as they knew. Brandon was also single according to his parents. So unless there was a significant other he managed to keep under the radar, it seemed unlikely that it had something to do with a breakup or something like that. Then, tragically, despite their concerns, Brandon's parents didn't report him missing until the following morning because they incorrectly believed that they had to wait 24 hours before notifying the police. Then, even though the police had been officially notified, they didn't exactly spring into action. Instead of beginning the search right away, they waited nearly a week to launch a full-scale investigation, maybe because they thought that Brandon was just another teenage runaway who would eventually turn up. The police did eventually question and ultimately clear Brandon's coworkers, including his supervisor, and the girl who was supposed to give him a ride to work that day. They also questioned his friends, who also they had no idea where he was or what had happened to him. Interestingly, many said that they hadn't seen or talked to Brandon in a few weeks. Then, a search of Brandon's room revealed that he hadn't taken any belongings with him, and there was no sign of him when investigators checked the footage from the high school's security cameras. Pretty quickly, the police were almost completely out of options for places to look for a lead. They even happened to check the state's sex offender registry, which did reveal an offender who lived on the same street as Brandon. But police questioned and searched the home of this person, and nothing came of it either. There was also a young man who lived about a block away, who neighbors were suspicious of when he moved out shortly after the disappearance. But again, no connection was ever made and it's unclear if police even looked at this lead. Another red flag that's led to speculation that something bad happened to Brandon was that he only had between $40 and $60 in cash on him when he left for the high school that day. So if he disappeared voluntarily, he couldn't have gotten very far without some other source of money. He also had about $650 in the bank, but since his disappearance, it's never been touched. There's also never been any activity on his cell phone account, and nobody's ever tried to pick up his car from the repair shop. In addition to that, Brandon was supposed to start his new DJ job a week after he went missing, but he never showed up for that either. Unsurprisingly, the Springfield police received multiple tips from people who claimed to have seen Brandon. One supposed sighting was reported to have taken place at the nearby state park, but police were never able to confirm that it was Brandon or if the tip was even authentic. Eventually, the tips stopped coming in too, and Brandon's case officially went cold, which is kind of insane when you consider that he vanished in just a short 4-block distance from his house to the high school. Now, more than 2 decades later, the Springfield Police Department has officially labeled Brandon's case a homicide. Just 4 blocks, that's all it took for someone to vanish forever. And in the absence of anything concrete, a number of theories have emerged. The first theory is that Brandon was abducted, either by person or people that he knew, or somebody he didn't know. It's worth pointing out that Brandon was 19 years old and around 6 feet tall and 170 pounds, which is definitely not someone who would be easy to forcibly abduct. However, if Brandon knew and trusted his abductors, he may not have put up a fight, especially if they played the sympathy card by convincing him that they needed his help. It's impossible to say exactly what happened, but it's at least conceivable to think that Brandon's learning disabilities, introverted nature, and faith may have put him in a particularly vulnerable position. Another interesting aspect of Brandon's case is that another 19-year-old Springfield man named Elijah Eli Rhodes disappeared a block away under similar circumstances, just a month later on July 20th, 2001. Samuel left his home in the middle of the day to attend a previously scheduled job interview, but unlike Brandon, he actually made it to his destination. Then, after the interview, he was never seen again. In addition to being the same age as Brandon, the timing and proximity of the 2 disappearances is uncanny to say the least. But whereas Brandon's disappearance was all over the news, Samuel got far less media coverage, and much less is known about his background. It's worth noting that he does have a missing persons card on the Springfield Crime Stoppers website. Tragically, it's right below the entry for Brandon's case. If there is a silver lining to this tragedy, it's that Brandon's parents used their son's disappearance to make positive changes in how missing person cases are handled. Because of the frustrating lack of evidence and answers, they founded a nonprofit organization called the Brandon Project, aimed at promoting awareness of missing persons cases. The hope is that increased media coverage will produce more tips and leads that could ultimately help some families reunite with their missing loved ones. In early May of 2008, an 18-year-old Arizona man named Ethan Maddox casually informed his sister he was going for a walk. Ethan was still coping with a tragedy that had rocked his family 2 years before, but on that particular day, nothing seemed out of place. Ethan often took long walks in the woods to clear his head, but this time he didn't come back, and his family would never see him alive again. Joshua Vernon Maddox was born on March 9, 1990. He and his 2 sisters grew up in Prescott, Arizona, which is about 20 miles northwest of Arizona Springs and just a few miles west of the Prescott National Forest. With a population of less than 8,000 people, Prescott is a tight-knit community, surrounded by more than 1,000,000 acres of Bradshaw Mountains. Ethan and his siblings' childhoods were almost perfect by most accounts until his parents separated and he and his sisters, Ruth and Kate, moved in with their father, Mike. By the time he was a teenager, Ethan was lanky, long-haired, and generally well-liked. And nearly everyone who knew him described him as a free spirit, who was also a good student and a talented musician with a witty and spontaneous sense of humor. On the surface, Ethan appeared to be a happy, hardworking, and carefree guy. But under the surface, he may have been far more troubled and distraught than anyone thought when he went missing in 2008. It's for this reason that Ethan's older sister, Kate, thought nothing of it when he walked out of the family home on May 8th. After all, Ethan was a nature lover, and Kate always suspected that the long walks he frequently took in and around the forest were just his preferred method of self-therapy. Up until then, Ethan had always returned within a few hours, so it wasn't really alarming when he hadn't shown up by sundown. Then, he still wasn't back by the time his father and sisters turned in for the night, and the following morning, his bed was still empty. By then, he'd been missing for much of the previous day and an entire night, and his dad and sisters started to wonder if he was okay. Still, their thought was that maybe he decided to camp in the woods by himself or spend the night at a friend's house without bothering to tell anyone. Then, as the days passed, though, without any sign of him, his family started calling his friends, visiting his known hangouts, and checking local homeless shelters where they thought he could have ended up if he had a breakdown. Unfortunately, after several days of searching, there were still no sign of him. And so, on May 12th, 5 days after Ethan had disappeared, his father officially reported him as missing to the local police. Now, waiting nearly a week to report a missing person may seem odd, but since the death of his older brother 2 years prior, everyone in the family had sort of come to an understanding that things were different. Under the circumstances, it wasn't uncommon for each of them to just want to be alone for a while. Official and unofficial searches were conducted in and around Prescott, but by the 2-week mark, not a single trace of Ethan had turned up. During which time, the local police department was criticized for taking a nonchalant attitude toward the case. But Ethan was technically an adult, and there's nothing illegal about disappearing when foul play isn't involved. Meanwhile, his family continued to hold out hope that they'd wake up one morning and find him sleeping in his bed. His older sister, Kate, couldn't help but worry about her brother, but at the same time, conversations they'd had prior to his disappearance gave her some hope that he might be alive and well. Ethan told Kate on more than one occasion that he was destined for some great adventure and that he may have to disappear for a while to set things in motion. With that in mind, Kate thought that it was also possible that he'd simply hooked up with a new band and set out on tour with them. Everyone also thought that it was possible he just couldn't deal with the memories he had in Prescott and figured that the only solution was to get a fresh start somewhere else. Wherever Ethan was, Kate hoped that he'd show up a few years later with a wife and kids, and that everything would go back to the way it had been before May 8th. It's easy to see how this could be seen as wishful thinking, but Kate may not have been that far off base. Ethan didn't run with a bad crowd. He didn't appear to have any problems with drugs or alcohol, and there was no evidence that a crime had been committed. Ethan's father, on the other hand, though, wasn't sure if he'd ever been able to put his brother's death behind him. In fact, he'd once stated that his brother's death had sort of pushed Ethan over the edge. Everyone also wondered whether the chronic depression that his brother suffered from also affected Ethan and forced him down the same path. Whatever the case, Ethan's missing person file remained open, pending new evidence that seemed increasingly unlikely as time dragged on. Nearly half a century before Ethan disappeared, a local man named Frank Delaney purchased a piece of land in Prescott that had once been home to the infamous Silver Rock Ranch. This ranch was originally owned by a Swedish immigrant known as Frank Dutch Westerly and was well known for the amount of alcohol that got drunk there and the gambling and prostitution that also took place there. According to local legends, Big Bert had been arrested on multiple occasions, but the charges were always dropped. Rumor has it that his clientele included local law enforcement and members of the legal community who did everything they could to get him off, to prevent their involvement with the ranch to be made public. Decades later, the new owner, Frank Delaney, built a cabin surrounded by pine trees, and his brother lived there up until 2005. After that, Chuck used the cabin as a storage shed, but without regular upkeep, it became pretty run down. Then, with real estate prices on the rise in 2015, Chuck decided to tear it down to make way for several dozen full-size homes. At 80 years old, Chuck wasn't up for doing the work himself, so he called in a local demolition crew to take care of it for him. And then the bulldozer stopped. In the rubble of the chimney, something horrifying emerged. They showed up one day with an excavator, and the job got off to a quick start, but things took an unexpected turn when the crew saw something in an exposed section of the chimney. Chuck waved frantically to the excavator operator before wading into the rubble to take a closer look. And to his horror, he was staring at what appeared to be a decomposed body in the fetal position, wearing only a thermal t-shirt. Even more horrifyingly, the position of the body indicated that whoever it was had attempted to crawl down the chimney headfirst. Chuck called the police immediately, and they arrived with the county coroner shortly after. Although the body in the chimney was badly mummified, after it was taken to the coroner's office for an autopsy, they were able to use dental records to identify it as Ethan Maddox. At this point, it had been several years since his disappearance, and 9 since the loss of his brother, which had to have just been crushing for the family. And although finally knowing where Ethan was had to have given them some closure, the circumstances of his death were just so weird otherwise. When the initial shock wore off, Kate guessed that it might have been a simple matter of Ethan letting his curiosity get the better of him. Maybe he was just looking for a quiet place where he could be alone with his thoughts. Whatever his motivations, it seemed that Ethan overestimated the size of the chimney, got stuck, and died. On the other hand, more than a few locals found it odd that the cabin had never been searched, even though it was less than a mile from Ethan's home. In particular, what Chuck found most puzzling was that nobody should have been able to get into the chimney in the first place, because he'd capped it with a heavy-duty rebar mesh to keep animals like squirrels and raccoons out. In his official report, the coroner noted that Ethan was found in the fetal position, with his head below his torso and legs. In other words, he must have entered headfirst from the roof of the cabin because the chimney was too narrow for him to have turned around once inside. The report also stated that he'd been naked except for a thermal shirt and that his hips were dislocated from their sockets. In addition, there weren't any signs of trauma like bullet holes or stab wounds. None of Ethan's bones were broken, and toxicology tests showed that there weren't any drugs in his system at the time of his death. Eventually, the coroner concluded that Ethan probably died from hypothermia or dehydration, and that his death was accidental. Either way, whatever ultimately killed Ethan, being inverted and trapped in such a confined space would have made for a particularly slow and unpleasant last few moments, however long they lasted. But how did he get there? And why was the inside of the chimney sealed shut? At least on the surface, the coroner's report seemed to put an end to the mystery once and for all. But not everyone was convinced that the case was so cut and dry. Following the ruling, Frank Delaney reminded everyone that he installed rebar over the chimney decades before. The coroner countered by pointing out that it could have been rusted away over the years, or that someone could have removed it. It's not clear exactly what happened to the rebar gate, but there's no mention of it in crime scene reports, and it isn't visible in any of the photos taken at the site. One thing Frank Delaney and the coroner did agree on, at least, was that it was obviously gone on the day that Ethan crawled into the chimney. But rebar aside, additional evidence found at the cabin made the accidental death ruling seem a bit premature. Like, for example, a breakfast bar that had been built into the firewall had been torn free and dragged in front of the fireplace, effectively blocking off the chimney from the inside. This had obviously been done intentionally, but by who and why? Then there was also the position of Ethan's body. What people couldn't figure out was why anyone would attempt to shimmy down a narrow chimney head first. Going in legs down seemed to make more sense, because upon reaching the bottom, you'd be able to land on your feet instead of your hands or head. Adding more controversy to the case, the coroner remarked off-record that he thought it would have taken 2 people to position Ethan's body the way he was found. Then, there was also the matter of the thermal shirt Ethan had been wearing, which wasn't weird on its own, except for the fact that the rest of his clothes were found inside the cabin, folded neatly by the fireplace. This meant that he'd either been in the cabin before and had folded the clothes himself, or that someone else had folded them for him. In light of these findings, the coroner even considered changing his original ruling, but he ultimately stuck to accidental death because he had little more than speculation to go on. The police and coroner's office received multiple tips after Ethan's disappearance, and although they continued coming in long after his body was discovered, public interest in the case eventually waned, and authorities seemed confident that foul play wasn't involved. For the most part, these tips were dismissed until one name kept getting mentioned, a man initially referred to only as Matt, and a number of tips was later identified as Matthew "Matt" Kessler. Like Ethan, he'd been a friendly and well-liked musician who lived in Prescott, and although Ethan and Matt weren't friends during high school, those who knew them said that they were both a lot alike and that they'd struck up a friendship after graduation. The weird part is that Matt eventually left the area and then went on to commit a multi-state crime spree. And when Ethan's body was found, he was serving time in a Texas prison. Matt had previously been incarcerated in Oregon, in Washington too, but an incident in northern Arizona ultimately threw the cause of Ethan's death into serious doubt. As the story goes, one evening, Matt visited a home shared by a caretaker and the disabled man he lived with. It's not clear whether the men were drinking or using drugs, but the caretaker excused himself to take a shower, and by the time he returned, the disabled man had been stabbed to death, and Matt was nowhere to be found. He was eventually tracked down and arrested, but he didn't confess to the murder. However, he did claim to have recently killed a woman in Sedona, Arizona, after which he stuffed her body into a barrel. The police would even find a woman in a barrel in Taos, but Matt wasn't charged with her murder because police already had a suspect in custody. He also wasn't charged with the disabled man's murder because the caretaker was killed in a bar fight a few months before and couldn't make an official statement and provide any evidence of Matt's guilt. But despite Matt's criminal past and history of violence, the police couldn't place him anywhere near the cabin at or around the time of Ethan's disappearance. In the end, Ethan's death will probably always be considered accidental, at least officially. With that said, the true ramifications of his brother's death and his own mental state will never be fully known. And in addition, the out-of-place breakfast bar, the clothes neatly folded by the fireplace, Ethan's position in the chimney, and his known association with at least one dangerous character will always cast some doubt on his mysterious disappearance and death. Hello everyone. Thank you all so much for watching. I'd love to hear your theories down in the comments about what you think happened to the people in these stories. This video is part of a series, so if you want to see more like this, definitely check out the rest of the videos in the series, or some of the other series on the channel. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to send to the email found in the description or to the Scary Interesting subreddit. And hopefully, I will see you in the next one.